You're listening to an episode of What on Earth is Going On? This show was originally broadcast on the radio at CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, Ontario, Canada. It is now available to you in this format with all spoken content unabridged. For more information, visit wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Hello, and welcome to What on Earth is Going On, where we take you beneath the headlines to discuss the events, the characters, the forces, and the ideas that shape the human story today. Each week we talk with somebody who thinks, and thinks deeply, about what is going on. Climate change, populism, artificial intelligence, you name it. Why are things happening? How did they come to be? And where are we all headed? If you have any questions or feedback, please get in touch. You can find the show online at www.wogoshow.com. That's WOEGO show.com. Follow on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter. Download episodes on whatever podcast app that you use, and most of all, make your voice heard in the ongoing discussion. On this episode, we're talking about trade. A lot is unfolding right now, not just by the day, but by the hour. And by the time this episode hits the airwaves, it may already be out of date. Has U.S. President Donald Trump made good on his threat to pull out of NAFTA? Have they imposed more tariffs on their allies? Has the trade war started? At last week's G7 summit, hosted by Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in Charlevoix, Quebec, Trump showed up late and left early. As Trump left for a summit with North Korea's Kim Jong-un, Trudeau repeated in a press conference that Canada will not be pushed around and reiterated retaliatory tariffs. Trump hit back on Twitter and sent out his advisors to say that there is a special place in hell for people like Justin Trudeau. And he has said that Canada will pay for the slight. Meanwhile, in Singapore, Trump says that he has formed a special bond with North Korea's dear leader and that he trusts him. What on earth is going on? To help us get to the bottom of it, and not just the daily grind, but the deeper forces at play, here is my interview with an expert in international relations and trade. Robert Wolfe is Professor Emeritus of Policy Studies at Queen's University, where he is also the lead director of the annual Queen's Institute on Trade Policy. Before joining Queen's in 1995, Dr. Wolfe was a Canadian Foreign Service officer for nearly 2 decades, serving around the world and in Ottawa. His current projects focus on digital trade and how members of the World Trade Organization can use enhanced transparency to encourage institutional learning. Professor Wolfe, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Pleasure.
So one thing I want to say right off the bat is that this episode is being recorded on June 7th of 2018, which is very important because the subjects that we're going to discuss are very timely. And as of tomorrow, with the G7 summit in Quebec, in Charlevoix, things might change completely. And our conversation will hopefully not be too out of date because we want to talk about the bigger issues. But it's important to note that things are changing quite rapidly, which is really the essence of the question on the show of what on earth is going on. So for my first question, it's always kind of a variation on the same thing. You've seen quite a lot of this world, both on the ground and in the Foreign Service. And as a scholar of international trade, I want to speak with you about some hot-button topics such as free trade, economic nationalism, the recent steel and aluminum tariffs that were imposed by the U.S. on Canada, among other allies, and of course the ongoing renegotiation of NAFTA. But before we get to all of that, I want to start off a bit more bluntly. A lot is in flux at the moment, especially when it comes to trade and more broadly the debate between open and closed societies, or the drawbridge down and the drawbridge up. From your vantage point and your experience, what on earth is going on today?
What's going on is that the process of globalization, that is of markets being more integrated, of it being more possible to know what's going on in multiple places around the world simultaneously, to buy your shirt from Bangladesh and it was just designed and the order placed 3 weeks ago. That process has been accelerating over the last 3-4 decades now. It's inexorable, it's not going to change, and it's disruptive. It means that some kinds of jobs that were done in one place are now being done somewhere else entirely. It means that people whose skills used to be valued and important are suddenly, their skills are not so important. It means It's also associated with increased flows of people as well as flows of goods and services. That means your neighbor may look different than you do. All of that is causing a lot of change and disruption in the world. And nobody likes change. Everybody feels uncertain about change. And so we are seeing a political response throughout the advanced economies of people uncertain, unhappy, pushing back against these inexorable forces. The result of that is leaders being elected in Europe, in North America, maybe even today in Ontario, who want to go back to what seems like a simpler time, who want a little more control locally. And that, of course, is being manifested in the world of trade.
So we're talking about globalization. We're talking about the growing interconnectivity of markets and how this is really not something we can turn back the clock on without some kind of catastrophe.
Nor would we wish to. We are all better off in Canada because of this process. Classically, what you get from more trade is you get more variety, just greater variation in the kinds of things you can purchase, and you get them at a better price. And both of those things have certainly been operative in Canada in recent years. The very idea that we could have asparagus year-round, for example, that was unthinkable when I was in university.
So you're talking about the benefits of trade and I guess free trade in terms of both consumption and production, so that Canadians are better off as a result of free trade because we can buy things for cheaper or buy things that we wouldn't otherwise get. Is that the classic argument for the benefits of free trade and international free trade, or is it maybe more complex than that?
Well, free trade is a nice idea in theory. Nobody practices it, particularly not Canada. We certainly aren't interested in free trade. It's one of the oddities of the past couple of generations that we talk about free trade agreements. NAFTA is over 1,000 pages. If you wanted free trade, you could write it on one page. Right? So these are not free trade agreements, but they're certainly more open trade agreements. And the benefits of more open trade is greater specialization, allowing us to do more of what we're good at and buy from the world the things they're good at. And it's really important to stress this over and over again. It's not just finished goods. It's all the bits and pieces and services that go into a good. So in the trade, we now call those global value chains.
Right.
But what it simply means is the bits and pieces of my iPhone don't all come from China. They come from all over the place. And the largest part of the value in an iPhone is the services Apple provides in designing it, marketing it, providing a service for it. That's where the largest part of the value is in an iPhone. And so we think of this big import to North America from China. It's not.
Right.
The part that's actually Chinese is quite small. So what we're really interested in is the way we can buy bits and pieces of things from everywhere, assemble them into bigger things, which we then sell on. And what that's doing is making everything we do more productive. And the more productive we are, it means the more jobs we have and the more we get paid for doing those jobs. And that's the real value of trade to us. And so ironically, given current debates, and this is part of the folly of what's going on in Washington at the moment, that means the more we import from the world of high-quality goods and high-quality services that we put into our production, the better off we're going to be.
So that's interesting, and it's something I wanted to talk about in this program, which is the current state of affairs with NAFTA, with the steel and aluminum tariffs imposed by Donald Trump, and the justification that Donald Trump and protectionists, economic nationalists give, especially from the United States, but other countries as well, which is that we have a huge trade deficit with the world. The United States doesn't actually have a trade deficit with Canada. It has a trade surplus, but say the trade deficit with China or the overall trade deficit. And what you're saying is that it's not just a trade deficit is essentially the comparison between that which a country imports and that which a country exports. And then if you're in deficit, you import more than you export. But what you're saying is that that's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's actually a good thing.
And so just let's unpack that for a second. Why is it a good thing that we might import more than we export?
Because we are buying, the world is sending us their production at a price that we think is affordable. So they're sending us their cars, they're sending us their semiconductors to put into something we're manufacturing. They're sending us their accounting services or their engineering services. People in other countries are doing work for us, and we're getting the benefit of it. So in that sense, imports, ironically, are a good thing.
Right.
But what's also important to remember is that a trade deficit is simply an accounting identity. It's not a real thing. It is, you add up the flows of goods and services, the flows of investment, currency, transactions, and that gets you to some kind of balance. Well, the balance actually is zero.
Right.
By definition.
Right.
So if you are importing more than you're exporting in goods and services, then you are probably making up for that by exports of something else. There's corresponding flows of transactions of one sort or another. And it only matters if that one part of that balance is unsustainable. So in the macroeconomics of why nobody should be worried about the U.S. trade deficit is beyond my expertise to explain. The simplest way to think about it for our purposes today is to think about the growth of the U.S. economy over the last 40 or 50 years, and think the U.S. has actually done pretty well in the world over that time frame. And through most of that time, it's been running a trade deficit.
Right.
So this is not actually a serious problem.
Right. Is it more the fallacy that I, as, say, the leader of a Western country, looks to China, sees all of the stuff that they're producing, all the money they're making, obviously, by producing all of this stuff as a workshop of the world, if you will, and then I want my country to be doing the same because, on the surface of it, it seems to be that if you produce more, you make more money. But really, it's also about what you bring in.
So take a hypothetical average American and hypothetical average Chinese. And ask yourself which you would like to be, right? The hypothetical average American earned, that is their share of American gross national product, last year, something like $55,000 US. China has been growing at a huge rate for more than 30 years now. Big increases in exports, big increases in gross national product. It's now, if it isn't already, the largest trading entity in the world. It soon will be. And the average Chinese person has income of about $6,500 US a year. So what do you want to be? You want to be Chinese?
Right.
Do you want to be American?
Perhaps the question they're asking is actually, do I want to be Chinese or American in 50 years or 100 years? Perhaps what the Americans are worried about, these economic nationalists represented by Trump, are worried about not where things are at, but where things are going. Is there any accuracy to that? Or, is this something we can't possibly predict the outcome of?
Well, if you want a 20th century thinker who would quip from John Maynard Keynes, in the long run, we'll all be dead. So 50 years from now is more than I want to worry about.
Okay.
Or you could think in terms of some of the realist thinkers in international relations who worry about rising powers and how established powers feel threatened by the rising power. And so you would expect, as China rises, America to get uneasy and feel threatened. And indeed, to some extent, that is indeed what we observe.
The so-called Thucydides trap.
Yeah. Should we worry about poor old Thucydides, who's been dead for some years now? I don't think so.
Right.
But that is exactly what some thinkers about international relations worry about. Whether it's real, what's interesting is the way, emotionally and psychologically, a lot of Americans now think that way. And it's foolish in one respect. In another respect, you could say, look, Wolfe, you're having fun with figures here and saying that the average Chinese person only has $6,500 a year to play with. The country is now getting close to being one of the biggest economies in the world. They have the capacity to be a major military power in Asia. The Americans cannot simply treat them as a little younger brother who's no particular challenge. Maybe not for 50 years. You could say they are a serious security issue now. And at that point, you have to say, what's the best way to deal with a challenge? Is it to bring out your baseball bat and try to hit that guy over the head? Mm-hmm. Or is it to say, let's figure out the rules of the game and we'll play baseball together here?
Right. And I think that's what a lot of, as you say, 20th century thinkers thought, which is that free trade, or whether we call it free trade or open trade or these international agreements, bring countries closer together and make it less likely that they may, say, go to war over their strategic interests. Sort of the golden arches theory of international relations that I think up until a few years ago, this is no longer true, but no two countries with a McDonald's restaurant had ever gone to war with one another. I don't know the example that makes that no longer true. But it seems to be that over the last century, we've gotten more and more peaceful over time. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're interlinked as a global society. And that if we start building walls, literally and figuratively, we may actually be making the world a more dangerous place.
What you're actually expressing is not a 20th century idea, it's an 18th century idea. Immanuel Kant expressed it still in the most elegant way in Perpetual Peace. It, I think, probably animated some of the drafters of the U.S. Constitution and how they thought about how the world would work. Some call it the liberal peace.
Right.
So it's certainly a liberal notion. Liberal internationalism would be the 20th century notion of it. When we speak of Pearsonian internationalism in Canada, we're simply talking about how Pearson gave life to ideas from Immanuel Kant.
Right.
I'm not actually being as liberal as all that in what I'm saying. I'm simply saying whether or not we trade with each other, become more integrated with each other, if we can at least agree on the rules of the game, then we can avoid conflict with each other. And that is the first thing. And so even if you think there's no possibility of interchange with China, no possibility of integration or learning from China, even if you have that most extreme view, and I don't, we're better off having shared rules of the game with China and trying to get both sides to play by those rules. And that the current U.S. administration does not inhabit that kind of mental universe. Well,
it seems like they almost want to attack and dismantle the rules-based order that the U.S. has constructed over the last 7 years. Is that what you see happening?
They certainly want to attack that order. The notion that the U.S. constructed it,
or led in the construction of it since the Second World War.
That's an interesting empirical proposition. There's certainly people who would say that's exactly how it happened. The U.S.
champions of the
dictated
world.
What the world should look like, and we all just wrote it down and then signed. I think the Trump view is that that's not what happened, that they got played by everybody else. And these aren't our rules. These are bad deals for the United States. However you think this rule order was created, they want to tear it down. And I think that's a bad thing, mostly because neither they nor anybody else has a good idea of what comes next. And playing by the rules works a lot better than saying, oh, no rules here. I've got my baseball bat. I'm going to see what I want to do with it. Beat you over the head with it. If you think that the United States is still predominant, that's a dumb policy. It arguably wasn't the U.S. policy when it was predominant. But the U.S. doesn't have that kind of power, especially in Asia anymore.
Right.
They cannot push China around that way. It's not clear they can push Canada around that way. That's part of the game that's being played out right now. But this attack on the rules, this notion that it's okay, somehow or other we can find a way to live without the rules, it's nuts. I was thinking about it in those terms when I was driving in today, and thinking how we drive down a street 50, 60 kilometers an hour. There's people coming at us at exactly the same speed. And we know that most of the time, they're not going to drive into us. They're not going to turn in front of us.
Right.
Their actions are relatively predictable. Of course, we have to be vigilant and observant all the time. It's helpful to have police to make sure that people who don't obey those rules are sanctioned. But we depend on the predictability that all of us are going to pretty much follow the rules in how the world works. And what the Trump people are doing is saying, no, we don't want that predictability. If you translate that more directly to trade terms, it's not so much that a trade agreement opens markets, creates free trade. What it does is it reduces uncertainty. Reduces uncertainty for governments and for firms, so that we have some idea of what our trading partners will do, and firms have some idea about what the rules are in another country. So a company that's contemplating $1 billion investment to make a new widget that's going to take 10 years for that investment to pay off, there are all sorts of uncertainties about what the world looks like over the next 10 years. But the trade agreements have reduced some of that uncertainty. They have some idea of what the rules are going to be. And the Trump administration, I think, quite consciously wants to increase uncertainty.
Is that a political maneuver, or do you think that they believe that there is some economic gain there?
Oh, I think they can benefit from it.
How would they benefit from uncertainty in a business climate?
If you don't know what the rules are going to be in Mexico, why would you build a plant in Mexico? You'll build a plant back here in the United States.
Oh, so you're saying creating uncertainty everywhere else but the United States, where things are good, business taxes are low, things are certain.
That's their fantasy. And it is a fantasy because uncertainty is uncertainty. If you have a government that breaks up the rules, then you don't know what rule they're breaking up next.
Well, and furthermore, the greatest American companies that we can think of made their buck and made their name internationally. Whether it's Apple or Google or Facebook, I mean, these companies got big on the shoulders of the world, not on the shoulders of the United States. And
they don't make things. I'm worried about General Motors.
Right.
I'm worried about U.S. Steel.
Right.
They make things and they make them here at home.
Right. And it reminds me of something that you said in a lecture that you gave in March. It was a quote of an adage in economics, which is that countries don't trade, firms do. And so if we take this very simplistic view of trade and international relations, we're forgetting all of the interconnectivity between people, between companies, between groups who aren't necessarily bound by these walls and by these borders, less and less so with globalization in the 20th and 21st century. So we're kind of missing the point when we are taking these economic nationalist hard stances. But what I'm hearing from you is that it's not just a political maneuver, that if they create disorder in China, in Canada, in Europe, everywhere in the world, the United States will benefit in this zero-sum, almost apocalyptic game.
That's their fantasy. And it is a fantasy because nobody makes whole things anymore, especially not the United States. So if they disrupt the supply chains on which their industries, their manufacturers depend,
right,
they're disrupting those industries. In the case of NAFTA, the most obvious is this idea that it would be a good thing to make Mexican car factories pay higher wages.
Right.
But if you think about the North American auto plant as a whole, and you think of it competing with the Asian auto plant as a whole, one of the problems North America has had vis-a-vis Asia is that Asia can draw on lower wages for building, for assembling autos, for making parts. And so what have we done in North America? Things that can be done by less skilled workers in making smaller, cheaper cars, we've got those in Mexico. In other words, we have our low-end, low-wage component of our supply chains. And it means overall, the North American auto plant is competitive with the Asian auto plant. If we disrupt that, if we say we're not going to produce, we're not going to do some parts of the whole production process more cheaply in Mexico, then that makes the whole of the North American auto plant less competitive.
Right.
And of course, the Trumpian answer to that is fine, we'll put 25% tariffs on all auto imports.
Right.
And at that point, we really are trying to break up the trading system. But this business of the uncertainty and the effects of some of these measures, again, it's a very naive view of how the economy works. It is certain kinds of jobs are good jobs, like the people who make steel. Other kinds of jobs we don't care about. That's the people who use steel. What we're seeing already with Trump's tariffs on steel is that some small manufacturers are going out of business. because the price of steel has gone up and they can no longer compete.
Sure.
And whether or not you put a tariff against imports from the world doesn't help very much because they're exporters. They're trying to use steel as an input to make a product that they send offshore. But if they send their product offshore and it's now costs too much because you've artificially raised the price of steel, they're out of business. So everybody lives in a complex, interconnected world, including people who you think are pretty small. A company in Kingston, Transformix Engineering, got a plant over on Gardeners Road, or on Highway 38, I guess is Gardeners Road. That's where it is. They make very complicated high-tech machines. You know how many they sell in Canada?
How many?
None.
Wow.
All they do is export. So if we put a tariff on the things that they put into their machines, we're simply making their products more expensive in the world markets in which they compete.
Right.
And that's just they have less than 100 employees. Right? This kind of thing can have ripple effects that go on and on and on throughout the economy.
And it seems like Trump's people, his team, maybe even Donald Trump himself, are also missing a huge piece of this, which is automation. And this is another thing that you mentioned in the same lecture that I brought up a few minutes ago, which is that the reason for economic uncertainty and the reason for the loss of all of these industrial jobs that conservatives the world over would love to bring back and go back to the 1950s halcyon days, the reason for the decline in industrial jobs over the last 20 years is not trade agreements, and especially not trade agreement between the United States and Canada and Mexico, but rather automation, the rise of the machines around us that produce and make the things that we use every day, and soon that will disrupt the whole service industry as well. It seems like they're missing that piece.
Automation didn't cause everything, but it's certainly a big factor. Probably the simpler, more abstract way to think about this is that we all want to be more productive. We all want to have more money so that we can buy more of the world's goods and services. And that basically means we all have to do more with the same amount of inputs. It's hard to put that in an elegant way, but the idea being that if we don't become more productive, if we can't get more output from the effort of each one of us, then we stagnate. Then we don't get to have a growing share of whatever it is we want, of housing, of food, of travel. And inevitably, over a period of decades, as we try to get more and more productive, it means certain kinds of jobs can't compete anymore. We see this most dramatically not in manufacturing, but in farming.
Right.
In the middle of the 20th century, half the Canadian population was engaged in agriculture in some way, shape, or form. Now, on the farm, it's somewhere between 1% and 2% of the workforce, maximum. It wasn't that long ago that we had tens of thousands of dairy farms in Canada. We might still have 10,000, but just barely. There was a time, and certainly in my lifetime, where you could make a living with 25 dairy cows. Now, if you have much less than 100, it's hard to make a living, and that's with supply management. The most productive farms have many more than 100 cows. It's the same throughout the economy. We become more productive, we use more technology, and that too is an inexorable process. Openness to the world makes that easier to a certain extent because we can get things we need from other people. We can sell things that we make to other people, but it's all part of an integrated process.
So I want to turn our attention to these trade agreements that we're dealing with right now in the news, that we're dealing with NAFTA. As best as you can, what is the essence of a free trade agreement, whether it's NAFTA or CETA, the agreement between Canada and the European Union, or the TPP, which the U.S. pulled out of? What is a so-called free trade agreement? What is it trying to do? And perhaps, I think we've already been there, but why is that a good thing?
Well, as I said already, it's trying to reduce uncertainty.
Right. Through 1,000 pages of NAFTA.
Yeah. And it does that. NAFTA I think, has 20 or 21 chapters. NAFTA 1.0, NAFTA 2.0. They were talking about as many as 31 or 32 chapters.
Right.
And each chapter could be thought of as a kind of an agreement unto itself. Some of them cover the whole agreement, like dispute settlement or administrative procedures, but some of them would be quite specific. So one I've been looking at a lot is on electronic commerce, e-commerce, or digital trade. You would have something on sanitary and phytosanitary measures. That's the food safety rules and plant health rules that can block trade for no good reason. You have technical barriers to trade chapters. That's called TBT in the jargon. You would have a chapter on tariffs, on market access, in other words, and on and on and on. And the more complex trade gets, the more complex our understanding of trade gets, the more chapters you have. Originally, mostly what you had to have was chapters that dealt with goods crossing the border. So they call them border measures. Thing like a tariff, quintessentially, is something that happens at the border. And you would have certain rules to make sure that whatever agreements you made at the border were not undone by something that happened somewhere else. So you had rules on most favored nation, on national treatment, so that once you, whatever you put at the border against me, you would have against everybody else. That's most favored nation. Once you admitted my product to the market, you would treat it the same as you would treat your own products. That's national treatment.
Right.
So that's kind of basic border stuff. But increasingly, as over the many rounds of negotiations in the GATT, as tariffs and other border measures were largely eliminated, they're now much smaller than they were 50, 60 years ago, we say that trade policy moved behind the border. Because it turns out there's all sorts of things in domestic policy that can have an effect on the ability of a firm in one country to sell its products to a firm in another country. And that's the domain, particularly of trade and services. So the rules on who can be licensed to be an architect have an effect on whether an architectural firm in Toronto can build a building in Buffalo. Actually have an effect on whether an architectural firm in Toronto can build a building in Montreal, but that's a separate problem for Canadians to deal with.
But an interesting one, because many people have argued that Canada itself, within itself, does not even have free trade, quote unquote, because different provinces have, it's one of the most decentralized countries in the world, and different provinces have authorities. And if I'm an architect or a plumber in one province, I may not be able to be one in another, and that there is an effect on goods and services within our own country. It's almost like we need a free trade agreement between the provinces before we start renegotiating these massive ones with other countries. But that's almost an oversight of Confederation.
It's probably a feature, not a bug of Confederation, but in any event, so we have lots of policies that are behind the border. And the more we reduce barriers in one area, the more we see, oh yes, there's still other things that are affecting the ability of firms to offer their services or to sell their products. And so trade negotiators, their agenda keeps expanding for that reason. But it also keeps expanding because of technological change. The economy is changing. So e-commerce wasn't something that had been imagined when we negotiated NAFTA a generation ago. Nobody had really heard of the internet when it was signed in 1994. Right? So things have changed.
Well, and you've said that a NAFTA 2.0, a new NAFTA, needs to be done. We need to be negotiating this now because of these very reasons. But then you add economic nationalism and protectionism to the pie, and it becomes very, very difficult. Especially, and another thing you've said that I find interesting is that Donald Trump's administration's objective with renegotiating NAFTA is completely unprecedented and unfounded in any kind of thought, economic or international relations thought. Which is that they're trying to reduce their trade deficit, and they're trying to make things better for American producers by renegotiating a trade deal with their largest trading partner to the north in a system that is so interconnected already. And we've gone through a lot of the pitfalls of this. But the fact that this is unprecedented, how is Canada dealing with this? How are the negotiators dealing with this almost bizarre objective on the part of the Americans, if it isn't just completely political?
I know a little bit about how the negotiators are dealing with it because I sit on something called the Trade Experts Advisory Council. So I get briefings periodically with the chief negotiator. So I have some insight into what they're doing, but it's a team of hundreds of people. And nobody who's not part of the government actually sits at the table and has a sense of what they're doing. My sense, though, is that they have a lot of frustration because the professionals they deal with on a day-to-day basis sometimes don't understand what the point of their proposal is any better than the Canadians do.
Right.
On the U.S. side, there's a bit of a disconnect between the official level and the political level. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to know what to do when you don't really know why they're making a proposal. So there was a lot of back and forth through the early process of the NAFTA renegotiation of trying to understand what the point was, what were they trying to achieve, and then trying to take some of their rather unusual proposals and seeing if there's a way we could reframe it or adapt to it in ways that would be advantageous to all three participants. What's so unusual about this kind of negotiation with this set of American negotiators is they didn't like that idea. They actually wanted a negotiation that would disadvantage Canada, that would bring jobs back from Canada to the United States. And so when we said, but
that's
not
even a problem.
Well,
yeah.
So take another area we haven't talked about, which is government procurement. Mm-hmm. That is the things governments buy, which in a modern economy like Canada, the United States, is a very large bill every year. And if you can't participate in government procurement, if you can't sell your microphone or your headphone or your computer to a government, then you're losing out on a very big market. Mm. The United States, and we've been negotiating on this for years. We have an agreement in Geneva through the World Trade Organization on government procurement. But Americans like to put in place what they call Buy America provisions, so that if you're building a bridge with public money, the steel has to be American.
Right.
Or whatever, on and on and on. And there are lots of Americans, many of them in the Democratic Party, not the Republican Party, who think those rules aren't tough enough. They want stronger rules on government procurement. And Canada says, so you want more access to our government procurement market, but you want us to have less access to yours.
Right.
How is that a good deal?
Right.
That doesn't make sense.
Well, it reminds me of the rules of origin proposals on the American side, which is, I believe is at 62.5% currently, that all the parts of a vehicle must be assembled or it must be origined in North America. And they want to increase that to 85%, and they want 50% to be American. And which for a trade agreement like NAFTA, that to me, that's just bizarre.
Well, that was their original proposal. The U.S. car industry said, are you out of your mind? Mm-hmm. Right? That just can't work. Canada and Mexico said, no, next idea, please.
Right.
And the part of the problem that we have faced right from the start with the rules of origin in autos is that it really is designed, it's not aimed so much at Canada, but at Mexico to undermine Mexican assembly plants. And the Mexicans quite rightly say, why would we ever agree to that?
Sure.
The other problem with it is it was designed, well, it wasn't designed. It took them a long time to actually put something concrete on the table. And it's one of the problems with it was that it was designed or conceived by people who had no idea what goes into a modern car. If you think about a car today, there's this center stack. It's the audio system. It's the nice little display on which you can see a map, some very sophisticated electronics in the center stack. It's mostly not North American. So to get to 85% North American content, you would have to be able to design and build the center stack in North America. You couldn't do that in 6 months or even a couple of years. Mm-hmm. You could get there. Of course, why would you? Mm-hmm. If it's being done more cheaply and more efficiently in Asia, why don't you keep buying the center stack from Asia? So there were lots of those sorts of problems of trying to achieve an old-fashioned objective using old-fashioned means that made no particular sense in the context of today's automobile manufacturing industry. And there were a couple of other things like that were explicitly nationalist, that were not designed to grow the pie. They were designed simply to advantage the United States vis-a-vis everybody else. And that was, from the start, that's been very difficult for Canada and Mexico to deal with. We've always said we'll stay at the table as long as the Americans want to stay at the table. We'll talk about whatever ideas they put on the table. But if we can't see an outcome that's advantageous to Canada, why would we do it?
Right. And you've said before that Canada would not accept a bad deal. It would rather have no deal than a bad deal because we would revert then to the WTO standards. But I also know that Donald Trump has attacked the WTO. And perhaps if he has the political capital to do it, that'll be his next target. If NAFTA does go the way of the dodo bird. I mean, can you even envision a world without the WTO? Maybe we should explain what the WTO is, actually, first.
The World Trade Organization is, and the WTO treaty is a capstone treaty that covers something over 30 individual aspects, a bit like the chapters of a free trade agreement. And one of the things it covers is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade from 1947, which was simply incorporated into the WTO. But there are a number of other agreements, much like the chapters of a free trade agreement, including the General Agreement on Trade and Services, the trade-related intellectual property agreement, TRIPS, and so on. So it is a set of rules of the road for the global trading system. It's also a sophisticated conflict management system, a lot of committees that meet to try to sort out problems that emerge in one domain or another, and a dispute settlement system. So it's all of those things. And Trump has been clear for 30 years that he doesn't like any international agreement of any kind that the United States has ever signed. He's a much better negotiator than every negotiator the Americans have ever had.
Right.
He would do a better job. And this actually goes back to the 1980s. This isn't a new idea with him. He's always had this idea. And we have to remember that some parts of the WTO, particularly aspects of the dispute settlement system, the Obama administration was not happy with. The Bush administration was not happy with. So some of his so-called attacks on the WTO are simply the end stage in a process of Americans not being happy with certain aspects of how the WTO works. The thing that is unusual and is getting people more and more worried is there doesn't seem to be any interest with this administration in trying to find some common ground, in trying to find a solution. So people in Geneva would say, okay, fine, tell us what you would like to do to fix the system. And they don't do that. So there is a risk that the dispute settlement aspects of the WTO will fall apart. And of course, there is a risk that Trump would say, okay, you guys want to trade by WTO rules? I'll withdraw from the WTO too.
Right.
That, of course, is truly pulling down the pillars of the world economy. The members of Congress seem so far to be spineless. We have Mitch McConnell saying, I don't want to put in legislation that might tie the president's hands in any way because that might diminish his negotiating leverage. This is with respect to the president's abuse of the national security provisions of U.S. trade law.
Which were used to impose the tariffs on steel and aluminum.
That's right. Would there come a point where the president pushes even Mitch McConnell too far? Because the president actually has very little authority under the Constitution for trade policy.
Right.
It's mostly granted by Congress, and what Congress gives, they can certainly take away.
It's trade promotion authority, right?
That's right.
It almost sounds like, to go back to your previous analogy about the rules of the road, for example, people going 60 kilometers an hour in a 60 kilometers an hour, maybe it's 50 and they go 60, but that's okay. A little bit over is fine. But there's a certain sense of rules that we all understand when we live in our world. And it's almost as if the United States objective is to not just remove the signs, but to take out the lights, to take out all of the rules altogether, because Americans want to drive at 100 kilometers an hour or 200 kilometers an hour. and not recognizing the catastrophe that would lead to. But hey, we get to drive faster, so I guess that's all that matters. And by pulling down the pillars of the global economy, like you say, with the WTO or with all of these other trade agreements and the, such a basis for global life with trade, it seems to me that nobody, including Donald Trump and his administration, can predict what that kind of world would look like, and certainly couldn't predict that the United States could control it or even benefit from it in the end.
I don't think, to be charitable, nobody could predict it. I think he certainly has no idea what he's doing. He truly has no idea what he's doing. Most people in my field think we do know what the consequences would be, and nobody would like it, least of all him. And I think that's the message he's getting loud and clear from the U.S. business community. Maybe by the time of the midterm elections this year, the business community, through their checkbooks, will be making it clear to members of Congress just what their worries are about what he's doing to the basis of American prosperity.
Well, so I don't know if you're equipped to answer this question. I know that I'm certainly not, but I'm going to ask it anyways, which is that the American economy, through Wall Street, through the stock market, has continued to climb since Donald Trump's election. There have been a few blips here and there when he threatens to pull out of some trade agreement or he makes some crazy tweet. But what seems to be happening is because he's promising and has delivered on reducing business taxes and reducing regulations through, say, the EPA, it seems like the American economy is growing at a good clip. Now, maybe this is just the calm before the storm of a recession that will always hit because that's the way the economy happens. But it seems that the American economy is doing just fine with Donald Trump at the helm. And now that he's been there for about a year and a half, it seems like all of his threats, the uncertainty of his presidency has not materialized in the form of economic downturn.
Well, in fairness, most of what we're living through is the Obama presidency.
Right.
The macroeconomic phenomena take a while to work their way through. So most of what you think of as a Trump boom is actually just a continuation of the Obama boom. A lot of what Trump says he's done, he hasn't. There's actually been very little real deregulation. There's just been threats of deregulation. Environmental regulations are very hard to get rid of. Scott Pruitt at the Environmental Protection Agency has kept finding ways to have a new corruption scandal.
Right.
He hasn't actually accomplished much. Tax reform is real, but the effects of tax changes don't happen instantly.
Right.
So all that's really happened is that business had a certain amount of confidence that things would be okay under Trump, maybe even good, and to the extent that business confidence has real effects, we're seeing the results of that.
But I guess you're almost asking my question 10 times better than I did. Why is business confidence not declining as rapidly given the objectives of this administration?
I don't know. Business, certainly we're seeing growing signs that business is very worried about Trump's trade policy agenda. On the other hand, he should have reappointed Janet Yellen to the Federal Reserve, but the guy he did appoint is not doing anything radical.
Jerome Powell, isn't it?
Yeah. So there's a kind of continuation of interest rate policy in predictable ways, so that's fine. Trump promised tax reform, and they got it through. Smart people are saying, I wish he didn't do that, because it was actually really dumb tax reform. And the United States economy is going to be paying very heavily for this tax reform, because it's basically adding huge stimulus at a time when the economy actually it's probably humming along close to full capacity, so it didn't need stimulus. So the result is we're going to get either inflation or high interest rates or both.
And a bigger dip when the dip comes.
That's right. And less capacity to deal with it when the dip comes. So as the Obama boom began to run out of steam, that was the time for tax reform.
So he's almost extended the Obama boom artificially, although that's a funny word to use. It's all artificial. But and as a result, we're going to pay for the consequences. And of course, I mean, to go to American politics, the people who are probably going to pay the most are the ones who voted for Donald Trump.
That seems highly likely.
Right. I guess there's just one more question that I have about NAFTA, which is what I mean. I shouldn't ask you for a prediction, but with these recent tariffs on aluminum and steel that have been imposed, do you think that there's a good chance that we're going to see? I get the fact that Canada is not going to sign a bad deal because it wouldn't be in its interest. The United States has leverage, but not that kind of leverage. I mean, do you think that we're going to get a deal, say after the midterm elections in the United States, whatever the way that goes? Or do you think that with this administration continuing the way that it is, that this deal is probably gone?
Well, so far, there is no evidence that Trump is able to get a deal with anybody about anything. I don't mean to say that as a joke.
Sure.
He just hasn't accomplished anything in terms of deals with foreign countries.
Right.
As of today.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of the summit this weekend, maybe we'll see some capacity to make a deal. By the time he comes back from Singapore, he may have done something with North Korea. Out of my competence to say whether that's likely to be the case. Mm-hmm. So far, we've seen him being very good at destroying deals, as with Iran, as with TPP. We haven't seen him achieve a deal. So if there was a deal on offer with NAFTA, would he take it? We've no idea. Will he give his trade negotiator, Robert Lighthizer, enough negotiating authority to get to a deal? Because some of the resistance, some of the crazy proposals from the United States on NAFTA clearly come from Lighthizer himself. He doesn't like dispute settlement, so he wants to undermine it. That's him. That's not Trump. Others are him trying to do what Trump wants him to do. So the question is there a possible deal out there that Lighthizer would be prepared to recommend to Trump, and would Trump be prepared to accept it? My sense so far is the answer is no. That the kinds of compromises with Canada and Mexico that would be needed to get a deal, Lighthizer has not been prepared to make. At the moment, it's moot. There will be no political level talks until after the Mexican election. Mm-hmm. So we're safe recording this today and playing it next week because the Mexican election is not till July 1. Will they? My expectation in a rational world is that the working level negotiators will keep talking to each other all along, that the ministers will be back together in August, trying to think about where they are, what the shape of a possible deal would be. All they're going to say for public consumption at that time is, we're talking to each other, we're working, because you wouldn't want to announce anything before the U.S. elections, because, well, some people would be happy with whatever is announced, other people won't be. But it would be good if they could keep working away at it and get to the point where they have a package by end of November, let us say, ready to be put before the next Congress in January, with some hope that such a deal could be approved by the spring so that it stays out of the Canadian election next October. That kind of timetable is possible. They've done enough work that that kind of a deal is possible if the Americans want to compromise on the sunset clause, on dispute settlement, on Buy America, and so on rules of origin. There's just some very hardline positions that if they don't want to compromise, there's no deal. If they do want to compromise, well, then Canada can talk about supply management. The Prime Minister said publicly that he would do that. We can talk about the de minimis level on parcel shipments. Anything over $20, we charge duty. For the online purchasing business, that's not a good thing. We could raise it somewhat as part of a deal. Lots of areas where compromises are possible. What we don't know is if Lighthizer personally wants to make those compromises. And we certainly don't know whether his boss, Donald Trump, would accept any set of compromises that would work for us. Mm-hmm. That has been ultimately unknowable all along. And all we've seen in recent weeks is that he's somebody who loves tariffs, doesn't love compromise. Although it turns out he's prepared to compromise with China.
Right. Of course, which is what allies around the world of the United States are thinking, which is that you seem to be treating your enemies as allies and your allies as enemies. It's a bizarre relationship that he has with anybody, but I've also heard it argued that what his real strategy is to make an enormous, bizarre demand, bang his fists on the table, make a lot of noise, and then accept whatever deal he can get and call it a victory. That's really Donald Trump's negotiating tactic, going back to his days as a mogul in Manhattan. One final question, quickly, if we have the time, which is the words trade war. We have these steel and aluminum tariffs have recently been imposed. Canada is retaliating. Does this encompass a trade war, even in its incipient stages, or are we not there yet?
People have all sorts of definitions of trade war. This is not using war for a military purpose.
Right.
This is not trying to use war to cause another country to give in. This is not in that sense, this isn't a war. Is it a trade conflict that could escalate and get out of hand? Yes, of course it is. But trade war, even the numbers seem large, billions of tariffs here, billions of tariffs there. Actually, in the scale of the Canadian economy, let alone the U.S. economy, and the scale of Canada-U.S. trade, we're still dealing with fairly small percentages. Mm-hmm. That even if steel trade and aluminum trade were stopped completely, would not take more than a sliver off Canadian GDP.
Right.
So this is conflictual. This is unprecedented. This shouldn't be happening. It's far from the kind of disaster that you would call a war.
Right. Professor Wolfe, thank you so much for coming on the program.
Thank you for asking me.
That's our show. Thank you for listening to What on Earth is Going On. Remember that all episodes are available as a podcast, which can be accessed through any podcast app or found on the website, along with links to social media at www.wogoshow.com. I would love to get your feedback, questions, criticism, and suggestions. Your quote of the week is from The Economist magazine from April 28th, in an article about the popular uprising in Nicaragua. Here it is. It is often forgotten that authoritarian governments tend to depend even more on popularity than democratic ones do. Close quote. There is really no question that Donald Trump leans autocratic, and there are other world leaders who are pushing the boundaries of authoritarian rule like never before, though still under the guise, the veneer of democracy. Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey, Orban in Hungary, and Jinping in China. Donald Trump's new friend, Kim Jong-un in North Korea, is old hat. But while the unchecked power that these leaders seek may free them from the ballot box, it does not free them from the people. In fact, it may harness them all the more to majority will. When a populist firebrand gains power and turns despotic, he does so riding on popular support, not just people's votes, but their tacit agreement, their willingness to show up in the public square or in an online forum, and their obedience. It's a pact that requires action from the leader, sometimes drastic action, and this is where scapegoats come in. Round up immigrants, wage war on evildoers, dismantle the fake news media, root out the elites, fight back against Canadian dairy farms. A liberal democracy constrains power in order to legitimize it. Moderation is the path to power. But an authoritarian, a strong man that Trump envies and wishes he could be, only action, constant, escalating action, can legitimize him. The question is, what action comes next? Thank you for listening. For more episodes, visit wogoshow.com, that's WOEGO show.com, or search for What on Earth is Going On in your podcast provider. See you next time.